Ladies and gentlemen, today's video is a bit different. So we're not going to show any specific tip, a new tip. We're actually going to review some of the, I would say, terrible mastering advices. Some of them are good, but just misunderstood and overused by people or generally used in a wrong way. Let's start with the first one, so we don't lose any time. The first one is high pass to 20 Hz in mastering. Now, why is this a good and why is this a bad tip? First of all, it's a good tip and it depends on the genre. Let's imagine you work on, for example, some pop, maybe rock tracks that don't really need the energy coming from, let's say, below 20 Hz, since we can't theoretically hear those frequencies. However, we can feel them. But let's first discuss why it's good to high pass like this. It's good, again, it depends on the genre, but you can also retain that energy coming from the kick, coming from the bass. If you, for example, cut off those frequencies, they can affect the kick and the bass in a very negative way. So this also brings us to the question, why is this kind of filtering bad for your sound? If you roll off those frequencies, you can lose the energy in your kick, in your bass, and overall in your sub. And your track will feel a bit thinner and just like it's losing energy. That can be a good and that can be a bad thing. So my advice is to never go for a specific frequency range when doing a cut like this. Also, if you use a cut like this, make sure you use a linear phase. Now another example, what if that specific cut doesn't work up to 20 Hz? Maybe it works up to 15 Hz or maybe 25, 30 Hz. Those are all the factors you need to consider. The second on the list is compression is a must in mastering. 2 dB of gain reduction. This can be a good tip because when you compress your masters, you can bring that additional tightness to them and just make them feel a bit more in place so they translate well later and so they affect your limiter or maximizer or any other processor a bit different, a bit better. However, why is this a bad tip? Because usually when we work in mixing, especially in electronic music, we have tons of compression, we have limiting. So using compression too often or in mastering in general can also introduce distortion to your picks or just make them very weak. So this is why it's very important to first choose the right compressor you're going to use, if you're actually going to use one, to carefully think the settings you're going to use, and also the gain reduction. 2 dB of gain reduction is again the maximum, but it's not always recommended. Sometimes 0.2, 0.5, 1 dB of gain reduction is what can do the job for you. And again, compression is not a must in mastering. It's an option, a creative option. Next on the list is expanding the top end in terms of width. So why is this a bad tip in general? Because people overuse this tip. They use stereo wideners, they use ozone imager, any other widening processor and just mess up the whole range. And this later affects your instruments, your hats and basically everything. And when you sum your mix in mono, you don't have any mono compatibility, except your kick and your bass, for example. And this is what makes some problems. However, this can be also a good tip if you know how to use this and how much to expand. For example, I like using Dr. MS, I like using Ozone Imager, I like using Space Control, I like using many plugins and processor and also some analog gear, SSL Fusion, to bring stereo width up. However, I'm doing that musically, according to my ears, just to make sure I keep that mono compatibility while still having enough width to be satisfied with. When people expand the top range, generally, there comes one mistake, and it's usually displayed in hats not being able to translate well in some club systems or overall in studio. When you expand the top end as much, your hats won't be retaining that mono compatibility. For the result, you won't really have them enough in the mix and they won't be as punchy, as present in the mix as you want them to be. The following mistake is very interesting because a lot of people tend to make it. It says, clip the picks, and overall clipping. Understand me, clipping is not a must at all in mastering. It's a creative decision. Clippers are designed to be used as a creative effect. So would you like your kicks, especially in mastering, would you like your kicks and overall picks to sound a bit more rounded, a bit more punchy? If so, you can use a clipper. However, using a clipper without a purpose just to make sure you get some of the headroom is completely pointless. You shouldn't be using them like that. The best way to use clippers is to decide what do you want from clippers. Do you want to go for serial clipping? Do you want to go with one clipper? And also, which clipper are you going to use? Are you going to use orange clip, gold clip, standard clip, Van Audio free clip, Sound Theory's Craft Tour clip? Any clipper that you like. You have to decide if that's the one you want to use, or you should go for a bit different processor, or if you should use clipping in general. If you're going to use a clipper, know that the clipper will highly affect your audio and the picks and the way your audio sound. It can make your tracks sound a bit more aggressive, a bit more gritty. So if you're working on some chill tracks and you're planning to use a clipper, that might not be the good solution. In other cases, if you use clipper on aggressive tracks, they can introduce distortion that you can barely hear, but once you push later with maximizers, limiters, or any other processors, the distortion can be even more audible. That's why you need to make sure to use clippers properly, and I explained this many times, and more tutorials are about to come, but just be aware of this specific mistake. And last but not least, limiters are a must at the end of the chain. This is a big mistake as well. Limiters do work. I use them. I have analog limiters. I use plug-in limiters. I use many of them, and I'm a huge fan of them. However, did you ever think about using a maximizer instead of a clipper? They're not the same. They sound completely different and they do a different job. There are many alternatives instead of using limiters. And also, when you use limiters, people usually go for the default settings for each of the masters they do. You shouldn't go for the same attack, same release times, same amount of gain reduction, same channel linking, or whatever you use, for example in Pro L2, or in Better Maker mastering limiter, or any other limiter you use, or even intelligent limiters, which are great. You shouldn't go for the same settings, and limiters again are not a must. There are many cases where I used maximizer, device maximizer, which sounds incredible in mastering, and it sounded much better than the exact limiter I wanted to use on a specific track. There are also cases where I used Sonox Oxford limiter, where I used Pro L2, when I used many different Better Maker limiter instead of maximizer, and the results were much better, much louder, much cleaner, everything was better. So again, limiters are not a must in matching. There are also different processors. Keep that in mind. Final loudness can be achieved using different processors, not limiters only. So these are the 5 common mastering mistakes, and probably the worst one people make. Let me know what you think about this video, and if you want me to do a video about some common mixing mistakes. Make sure to subscribe and support the brand.